What unfolded during Jack Smith's appearance before the House Judiciary Committee marked a rare moment in modern political history, one where spectacle gave way to substance.
Good evening. Today, an indictment was unsealed, charging Donald J. Trump with conspiring to defraud the United States, conspiring to disenfranchise voters, and conspiring and attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. The indictment was issued by a grand jury of citizens here in the District of Columbia, and it sets forth the crimes charged in detail. I encourage everyone to read it in full. The attack on our nation's capital on January 6, 2021, was an unprecedented assault on the seat of American democracy.
What many expected to be a combative exchange designed to weaken or embarrass him instead became a quiet but decisive demonstration of institutional confidence.
As described in the indictment, it was fueled by lies. Lies by the defendant targeted at obstructing a bedrock function of the U.S. government, the nation's process of collecting, counting, and certifying the results of the presidential election. The men and women of law enforcement who defended the U.S. Capitol on January 6th are heroes. They are patriots and they are the very best of us. They did not just defend a building or the people sheltering in it. They put their lives on the line to defend who we are as a country and as a people. They defended the very institutions and principles that define the United States. Since the attack on our Capitol, the Department of Justice has remained committed to ensuring accountability for those criminally responsible for what happened that day. This case is brought consistent with that commitment, and our investigation of other individuals continues. In this case, my office will seek a speedy trial so that our evidence can be tested in court and judged by a jury of citizens. In the meantime, I must emphasize that the indictment is only an allegation and that the defendant must be presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law.
Smith did not raise his voice, dramatize his answers, or attempt to dominate the room. He simply answered questions directly and without hesitation. In doing so, he altered the power dynamic almost immediately. The atmosphere shifted from confrontation to stillness, not because of intimidation, but because of clarity. The facts he referenced were not hypothetical, and his conclusions were not speculative. They were the result of years of investigation, evidence gathering, and legal review. That calm certainty created a moment that even critics could not easily dismiss. The strategy that backfired. The hearing appeared, at least initially, to be structured as a trap. The expectation seemed to be that prolonged questioning, selective framing, or procedural pressure might produce contradictions or missteps. Instead, the approach unraveled quickly. Jack Smith's answers remained consistent, precise, and anchored in the legal standards governing federal prosecutions. When asked about responsibility, he accepted it without deflection. When asked about evidence, he referenced the legal threshold required for conviction, not just indictment. The strategy aimed at undermining credibility instead highlighted preparation and professionalism. Rather than exposing weakness, the questioning underscored the depth of the investigative process and the seriousness with which it had been conducted. What was intended as a takedown evolved into an inadvertent confirmation of competence. Evidence over theater. One of the most striking elements of the hearing was Smith's insistence on grounding every response in evidence rather than narrative. He did not speculate about intent beyond what the record supported, nor did he frame conclusions in political language. He repeatedly emphasized that indictments are not issued based on suspicion or pressure, but on demonstrable facts capable of meeting the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This distinction mattered. In a political environment often driven by rhetoric, Smith's refusal to engage in dramatization created a sharp contrast. The hearing became less about performance and more about process, less about accusation and more about accountability. That shift exposed the difference between legal reasoning and political messaging. The role of responsibility. When Smith stated that the decision to bring charges was his, he did not frame it as an act of defiance or personal resolve. He framed it as a function of duty. Responsibility, in his telling, flowed not from personal belief, but from evidence and law. He made clear that the actions alleged in the indictments were evaluated through grand jury proceedings in multiple jurisdictions, subject to review, challenge, and scrutiny. This emphasis on shared institutional responsibility underscored the legitimacy of the process. It also countered claims that the investigation was unilateral or arbitrary. By grounding responsibility in procedure, Smith reframed the narrative away from personal motives and toward systemic integrity. Addressing the classified documents matter. The discussion surrounding classified documents was handled with similar restraint. Smith did not embellish the seriousness of the allegations, nor did he minimize them. He explained the nature of the evidence, the legal obligations surrounding classified material, and the reasons such cases implicate significant federal interests. Importantly, he acknowledged the constraints placed on his testimony by court orders, choosing transparency about limitations rather than evasiveness. This approach reinforced credibility. Instead of appearing obstructive, he appeared conscientious, balancing openness with respect for judicial authority. That balance is not easily maintained, particularly under pressure, but it defined the tone of his testimony, transparency, and its limits. One of the more revealing aspects of the hearing involved Smith's willingness to testify publicly and at length. His stated preference for transparency stood in contrast to the procedural decisions that ultimately limited the scope of discussion. By openly acknowledging those limits and explaining their origin, he avoided the appearance of selective disclosure. Transparency in this context was not presented as unrestricted speech, but as an effort to communicate honestly within legal boundaries. That distinction mattered. It reframed transparency not as performance, but as accountability to both the law and the public. Responding to claims of bias. Claims that the investigation was predetermined or politically motivated were addressed without defensiveness. Smith did not deny that prosecutorial discretion exists. Instead, he explained how that discretion is exercised within established guidelines. He described consultation with senior leadership, adherence to departmental policy, and the sequencing of investigative steps. By doing so, he contextualized decisions rather than personalizing them. This method of response reduced the potency of bias claims. Rather than engaging in rebuttal rhetoric, Smith allowed process and consistency to speak for themselves. The result was a response that felt measured rather than reactive. The importance of legal thresholds. A central theme of the testimony was the distinction between probable cause and proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Smith emphasized that indictments represent the latter, not the former. This clarification is often lost in public discourse, but it is fundamental to understanding federal prosecutions. By reiterating this point, Smith reinforced the seriousness of the charges and the level of confidence required to bring them. He did so without asserting inevitability or predicting outcomes. The emphasis remained on standards, not certainty. This approach respected both the presumption of innocence and the gravity of the allegations, maintaining balance in a polarized environment. Experience without grandstanding. Smith's professional background, including years spent prosecuting complex international cases, was referenced not as a credential to impress, but as context for judgment. When asked whether his experience informed his conclusions, he answered plainly. There was no appeal to authority, only acknowledgement that experience shapes assessment. This restraint mattered. It conveyed confidence without arrogance and authority without dominance. In an environment where expertise is often politicized, Smith's matter-of-fact acknowledgement of experience felt refreshingly straightforward. Timing and misunderstanding. Questions surrounding the timing of the indictments were addressed directly. Smith explained that timing follows evidence, not elections. Investigations progress as facts are developed, reviewed, and corroborated. Indictments occur when evidentiary thresholds are met, not when they are convenient. This explanation countered claims of strategic delay or acceleration. By framing timing as a function of readiness rather than calculation, Smith reinforced the principle that legal processes operate independently of political calendars, even when outcomes intersect with them. The weight of institutional pressure. Throughout the testimony, there was an undercurrent of acknowledgement that prosecuting a former president carries extraordinary weight. Smith did not minimize this reality. Instead, he described it as a reason for caution, rigor, and thoroughness. This acknowledgement reframed the investigation not as aggressive, but as careful. It suggested that far from rushing to judgment, the prosecution team moved deliberately, aware of the precedent and consequences involved. That perspective challenged narratives portraying the investigation as reckless or partisan. Professionalism under scrutiny. Perhaps the most defining feature of the hearing was Smith's composure. Under sustained questioning, procedural constraints, and political tension, he remained steady. There were no visible signs of frustration or defensiveness. This composure was not performative. It appeared habitual. It reinforced the sense that Smith viewed the hearing not as a battle to win, but as an obligation to fulfill. That distinction altered how the testimony was received. It became less about confrontation and more about demonstration of institutional norms. A contrast in approaches. The hearing highlighted a broader contrast between legal process and political theater. While some participants relied on insinuation or repetition, Smith relied on explanation. While some framed questions as conclusions, he responded with distinctions. This contrast did not require commentary. It was evident in tone and content. The juxtaposition underscored the difference between advocacy and adjudication, between persuasion and proof. In that sense, the hearing became illustrative rather than argumentative. The significance of public record. The eventual release of the testimony added historical weight to the moment. For the first time, the public could observe the special counsel's reasoning directly, rather than through summaries or commentary. This visibility mattered. It allowed audiences to assess demeanor, clarity, and consistency firsthand. In doing so, it reduced reliance on interpretation and increased reliance on observation. The testimony became part of the public record, not as a spectacle, but as documentation of process. Accountability as a principle. At its core, the testimony reaffirmed a principle that underpins democratic systems. Accountability applies regardless of status. Smith did not frame this principle as moral judgment or political philosophy. He framed it as legal reality. Laws establish obligations, and violations trigger processes. Status may complicate those processes, but it does not negate them. This framing avoided absolutism while maintaining firmness. It emphasized continuity rather than disruption, reinforcing the idea that institutions persist beyond individuals. The human dimension of restraint. Despite the legal focus, there was a human dimension to Smith's testimony. His restraint conveyed respect for the gravity of the situation, not detachment. There was no triumph in his tone, no suggestion of personal victory. Instead, there was an awareness that legal outcomes carry consequences beyond courtrooms. This awareness lent the testimony a seriousness that resonated beyond partisan lines. It suggested that restraint itself can be a form of strength. Why this moment matters. This hearing mattered not because it resolved legal questions, but because it clarified how those questions are addressed. It demonstrated that legal institutions can function under pressure, that professionalism can persist amid polarization, and that clarity can counter spectacle. It did not demand agreement, it invited understanding. In an environment often dominated by noise, that invitation was significant. A standard worth noticing. What emerged from the hearing was not a portrait of heroism, but of standard practice executed well. That may be its most important contribution. By adhering to process, maintaining composure, and grounding conclusions in evidence, Smith modeled a version of public service that is often overlooked. It was not dramatic, but it was durable. It suggested that the strength of institutions lies not in forceful personalities, but in consistent adherence to principle. Closing reflection. In the end, the testimony offered a reminder that accountability is not about spectacle or retribution, but about process and proof. Jack Smith did not attempt to persuade through rhetoric or posture. He relied on evidence, standards, and restraint. That approach may not generate headlines as quickly as conflict, but it endures longer. In a moment defined by tension and division, the hearing provided a glimpse of what steady, principled governance can look like. It was not loud, but it was clear, and sometimes clarity is the most powerful statement of all.